Okay. Well, let's get started then, everybody. So thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is all focused on poetry pedagogy. It's titled Preach It Before You Teach It, How Building Your Love of Poetry Can Boost Your Confidence Delivering Lessons. Throughout this webinar, hopefully, it will give you lots of opportunities to think about your own practice. I've invited you as well, if you've got some paper, there will be different points throughout the lesson where you might want to write a few things down. It could be in terms of taking notes, but there'll also be some questions and small activities that I'll invite you to do, and it's quite helpful to be able to write as well. Of course, throughout as well, please do make use of the chat, and there will be time for questions at the end as well. So if you do want to add your questions into the chat, that will be great. Joining us quietly in the meeting as well, we've got Cassie from Collins, who's keeping track of all of your conversation, keeping track of the questions. And when we do have that Q&A at the end, Cassie will be feeding those questions over to me for us. So everyone, let's get started, shall we? This is what we're talking about, boosting our confidence teaching poetry by reflecting on our own relationship with poetry. We'll start with a bit of an introduction because I am just a random internet person at the moment. So my name is Jonny Walker. I'm a specialist teacher and children's writer based in East London in England. I was born in the north of England in a town called Doncaster. And as a kid, I was very lucky to have parents who read to me. And we had lots of visits to the library on our local estate. I grew very quickly to really like silly poetry, nonsense poetry, things like Dr. Seuss, The Owl and the Pussycat, Roald Dahl, things like that. Again, if you're in the chat, please do feel free if you'd like to share your own favorites. Things that many children today still discover in their early primary education. Also, my grandfather was somebody who blurred the lines between fantasy and reality, taking us on weird adventures, telling us peculiar tales about the place that we lived. Now, I realize more recently that lots of these experiences have shaped what I do now as a teacher working with children and as an educational writer. So after university, I became a primary school teacher at the age of 21, and I moved down to East London, where I am now. So I grew up in like a poor northern town in England, where most people didn't have much money. And the area that I then moved to, and my school community, had a lot of similarities with it. Newham, the London borough that I work in, is one of the most disadvantaged parts of the United Kingdom, but it also has many differences. In the school that I began teaching in, 99.7% of students spoke a language other than English at home, and they arrived at school not speaking English at all. Now, despite these different starting points, despite high levels of poverty, the children in this school and the children in the whole of the borough had some of the highest levels of attainment in the country. So in my first 7 or 8 years of teaching, I came to realize that the way in which children were learning to read and write, the high ambitions of the parent community, and the focused work of the teachers, all of this was coalescing together to create something that's pretty special. And poetry plays a really big part in that. I started to notice that poetry could do things for the children I was teaching that no other texts seemed to be able to do. It motivated them. It gave them a language to express themselves, to express their culture, their religion, and their languages. And it made them laugh, and it made them think, and it helped them to experiment with the English language. I started to realize that what I liked most about teaching myself was the kind of interactions and relationships that we can have when we are doing creative writing, and poetry especially. So bit by bit, I began focusing lots more of my work on that, developing interesting lessons and projects. Since 2019, I've been working freelance in education, mostly in schools in East London, including the school where I started, so I'm still there 14 years later. I run poetry retreats, so residential writing retreats for children. Some of the participants in today's webinar are representing one of the schools where this takes place, Glade Primary School. And on this, we take children out from East London schools and we go down to an area of beauty, this really nice forest area, about 3 hours outside of London. And we spend 4 or 5 days writing in nature. I'm going to refer to that project quite a lot because it's where I've learned many of the things which I want to share with you today. And now that's what I do. I go into primary schools, mostly teaching poetry, working with the teachers, working with the children. More recently, I've started writing as well. writing my own books for children, and I've had a couple of them published by Collins. One of them is Heroes and Quests, which is a collection of Greek mythology poems, and another one is called The Toothless King, which is hard to explain, but we'll just say it's about a greedy goat. On the screen, you can see a really wonderful set of Big Cat poetry books. So these are quite newly published, and each of these is a very different kind of poetry book. Collins recognized that the books which we are often finding in schools might be a little bit dated, or maybe they're not meeting the needs of the children that we're teaching. Times have changed, and the poetry that we have in our schools needs to change too. So this exciting new collection is an attempt to kind of bridge the gap, really. They're authored by a really great collection of writers. I'm going to refer to them quite a lot throughout today and give you some examples from them. And as a bonus for joining this meeting today, you'll all be receiving a set of 12 lesson plans tied to these books. So like I say, I'll refer to it several times. It's a good demonstration in itself of a huge range of poetic forms. The books that are on your screen show you that poetry can do many things. Some poetry can make you laugh, and some of it can capture the historical moments, such as the early life of Martin Luther King. It can be a form of play, like in the wonderful book Escape Room, and it can also be a way of telling your culture to other people, like in the book Island Song. So that's a bit of an introduction into what we're doing. I think it's time for us to get thinking ourselves. So I want you to think about your own relationship with poetry. This webinar is titled Preach It Before You Teach It. So what you think matters, and it matters for you, but what we think also has an effect on our actions back in the classroom. And in that way, what we think has an impact upon our children. My experience has been that it really helps us if we've cleared up our own thinking about poetry. You don't need to love every single thing about poetry in order to teach it well and in order to extract something very valuable from it. Understanding your own relationship with poetry, what it means to you, is a great foundation for your teaching. So I want to start today with a question. I would love for you to write this down on your paper. And the question is, what do you think of personally when you hear the word poetry? Have a think about that. Please write down your response. I'm going to give you about a minute where I'll consume a lot of water. And please do, if you would like to, add your response in the chat as well, if you would like to. Okay, 1 minute. Off you go, everybody. I'm going to read your chat. Great job, everyone. I can see some interesting things coming through here. This is wonderful. I was going to return to you in the chat as well, but I can't type to you, but I am reading your thoughts here too. So keep those coming. I'll give you another 15 seconds. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. Thank you to those who shared. Thank you also to those of you who are writing it and keeping it private. Just like when we're talking about teaching poetry with the children, you've got a right to your own thoughts too. So what you do with them is up to you. Thank you all for participating in that. So the question that we were looking at there, what do you personally think of when you hear the word poetry, is a question that was asked as part of a very interesting survey. This question and others like it was asked by researchers at the National Literacy Trust here in the UK. And this research went out to lots of different schools across the country, and the children's responses were collated in a report titled Children, Young People and Poetry in 2024. Cassie from Collins might post the link for you here in the chat as well. And we will just add, by the way, that all of the links will be available to you at the end as well. So let me show you this word cloud. This word cloud shows you the main responses that came through from the children. It will be interesting to see whether the way that you feel personally about poetry is similar or different to those of the children. Have a good look at this, okay? Now, even when I was looking in the chat just now, I saw rhyming popping up there. And certainly for the children, rhymes is synonymous with poetry. Rhyming and writing poetry are seen as pretty much the same thing for a lot of children. Many do see it as a way to express yourself as well, and they notice the shortness of poetry as compared to things like fiction and non-fiction texts. Now, I cannot not mention the fact that the word boring is looking pretty dominant there up in the top. For some of your children, and perhaps for some of you yourselves, this could feel true. In the survey, some children, actually more than half of them, said that they don't engage with poetry at all, whether because they're pushed to do so or by choice. Now, those children who do not engage in poetry were asked a follow-up question. They were asked, well, why don't you? Why don't you enjoy it? Now, they didn't say that it was because it was too difficult. What they did say was that it was boring, that it was about things that they are not personally interested in. Now, this is quite useful for us to know as teachers of poetry. All primary teachers, early year educators who this webinar is pitched towards, we are all poetry teachers. Now, which books we are choosing to use and how we're choosing the poems that we share and how they meet the needs of the children we teach, all of these questions are important ones for us to consider as part of our practice. Now, I have another question for you. I would like you to do a little challenge here. Again, you could do this on your paper or you could do this into the chat. I would like you to name 6 children's poets. Now, this is obviously a meeting that we're having in the medium of English, and many of your schools, for those joining us internationally, are in English language medium schools. These answers do not need to necessarily be English poets. This can be a reflection of where you are in the world. So I'll give you some time and I'll stop yapping. About a minute. Write down as many children's poets as you can. Let's see if you can name at least 6. I'm going to look in the chat now. 1 minute, everyone. Great job, everyone. I'm seeing Valerie Bloom. I'm seeing Michael Rosen, Julia Donaldson, Benjamin Zephaniah. Who else am I seeing? Great job. Wonderful. Keep those going. Those of you who are doing this and writing it on paper, please don't let my words prejudice you. You do whichever ones come to your mind. Great job, everybody. Wonderful stuff. Now, of course, I'm not asking this question as a kind of like professional gotcha. I'm not trying to trick you into sharing your knowledge. What I want to show you, though, is that this was another really, really fascinating research question. And this was a different kind of research. This was a different model led by the Open University. Where are we? Here we go. Yes. So in the UK setting, then, when researchers from the Open University did a large-scale survey working with teachers about this question, the results were actually pretty stark. So for one thing, only about 10% of teachers were able to name 6 children's poets. And in this UK-based research, I do want to emphasize that this is very much a culturally specific piece of research. It may be very different within your own settings. The names which were most commonly identified included Michael Rosen at the top of the list, Alan Alberg, Roger McGough, Roald Dahl, and Spike Milligan. Now, these poets are good. You know, their poetry is good, and it's stood the test of time. But not all of these poets are very contemporary. They're good, but it's not necessarily representative. It's unrepresentative of the diversity of what has been happening in children's poetry in the last 2 decades, but it's also unrepresentative in terms of authorship, in terms of the gender of poets, culture, ethnicity, language. So it's unrepresentative of working children's poets, but it's also unrepresentative of the children who are likely to read that work too. Now, this isn't to say that we should abandon this in and of itself, but what we do need to do is make sure that the children are getting the chance to engage with and interact with the full wealth and breadth of poetry which is being produced. And we need to be mindful of our role as people in schools at putting these books into children's hands. In some of our contexts, if we are not the ones to introduce them to these texts, they're not necessarily going to find it very easy to access them any other way. So we need to hold on to the brilliant poetry that we know, like these poets, but simply put, we need to do the work to deepen our own knowledge of children's poetry, so that we can find poetry that's modern, that's diverse, and that captures the reality of life for today's children. Now, I know I don't need to share this with you, but childhood in 2025 is wildly different, even to childhood just 10 years ago. What childhood is very, very different, shaped by social media, shaped by a kind of globalized culture where children around the world are reading the same books, listening to the same music, sharing the same songs, memes, jokes, coded language, all sorts of things. Childhood looks very different today, perhaps, to what it looks like in the books that they are reading, written by people who are from a different generation. Now, the poetry then that we share with children does need to keep on refreshing itself too. And I want to share some interesting resources with you to help you find great poetry in the English language here for you and for your students. Now, of course, I'm talking about my context here, which is the UK. For those who are joining from around the world, whilst these poets might be a great resource for you, I would also guide you to search out equivalent resources and publishers within your own countries, perhaps who are taking those active steps like Colin is doing to making sure that we have that breadth of diversity in authorship, in content, in illustration, making sure that the books are as representative as possible of the society in which they're being published. There's lots of fascinating stuff happening in lots of different cultures and countries around the world, and it will take some individual research in your own settings. So let me show you a few different things. First of all, I want to signpost the Clipper Prize. There'll be a link coming into you from Cassie from Collins here. So the Clipper Prize is an award given each year to the best poetry collections that are being published. Now, this is the best voted for by children and their teachers. They are part of that voting process, and it's a project which is led by the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education, the CLPE. Now, simply by engaging with the shortlist of poems every year, you will quickly find yourself encountering some really fascinating new collections. The shortlists might be a great way for you and your colleagues in school to introduce yourselves to great poets such as, and some of these names I've seen in the chat, so I know that you're a good bunch here. People like Carl Nova, Kate Wakeling, Matt Goodfellow, Valerie Bloom, Nikita Gill, Zara Weil, John Agard, Grace Nichols. All of these poets have been kind of heralded by the Clipper Prize, and it's a great way for you to encounter lots of exciting new things that are happening in poetry so that you can rely upon your reliable poets who you know already, but you can also bring new things into the mix. Now, another great resource to share with you is the one in the middle, the Children's Poetry Archive. This is a really interesting website which has a lot of versatile potential for your use in the classroom. Again, the link will come to you now if you want to have a little browse as you are listening. So the Children's Poetry Archive is a website that's regularly updated with poetry which is written for children, and it's designed to be a tool for the use in the classroom. It contains biographical information about the poets so that we can perhaps understand the person behind the pen. It also shares audio recordings of the poems as performed by the poet, which is a really useful thing to bring into our teaching cycles. It's very well organized too. So you can search for poems by theme, such as emotions, such as nature, such as magic, or perhaps you can search by poetic features. For example, searching for poems with great examples of rhythm or repetition. And finally, you can also search by type of poem as well. If you want to teach the children about limericks, for example, you can just search only for limericks and you will find some. The same goes for ballads or shape poems, all different poetic forms. You'll find them on this regularly updated Children's Poetry Archive. It's all there. The last thing I'm saying on my screen here is spend some time exploring some poetry for yourselves. Now, just from the way that you're responding in the chat, I can see that we have some poetry fans in the room already, and that's great. Make sure you, I guess, account for the fact that it's not wasted time, and actually reading this poetry is a great asset to you as a teacher as well. Even if the only change is that the children recognize that you are somebody who enjoys poetry, might bring it in. You might hear something the children are saying and think, this reminds me of a poem. I want to share it with you. Your own passion for the poetry that you like is something that you can share with the children, and it's a great thing to inject into your teaching. So, what are we going to look at next? Well, I want to spend the next sort of 20-25 minutes or so. Just 1 second, everyone. I'm just going to have a quick drink. I want to share 4 top teaching tips with you. These are the things that I have found really helpful in my own poetry teaching. This will give us a chance to do a little bit of poetry learning ourselves as well. And hopefully these ideas are quite practical so that should you wish to do so, immediately after this session is over, you will have some ideas of things you could go and play around with and experiment with the next time you're teaching poetry. I've found that these 4 things on the screen have helped me to deepen my own teaching of poetry and have built a lot of excitement and momentum around reading, writing, and performing poetry for the children that I work with. Here they are then. So I'll just list them here and then we'll go through each one in a little bit more depth. Number 1, make it lively and make it playful. Poetry is different from other forms of writing. It's much more open to interpretation, and it can be many more things than fiction can be. We can explore poetry in ways that take it off of the page, even within comprehension and reading lessons. Poetry is a place where interpretation is especially important. There isn't one correct way to understand a poem, and in our classrooms, we can really inject some life into the process. Number 2, we can harness the power of chat in poetry lessons. In schools, I don't need to tell you this, but we are always rushing and we feel rushed. Now, one of the challenges we have is that good, thoughtful, mindful poetry doesn't easily grow from that circumstance. The poetry lessons then can be a place where we protect the quality of our interaction, of our chat. And this chat, this informal talk, is part of the poetry classroom, as far as I'm concerned. It can be part of the reading process and part of the writing process. So we'll look at that in more depth too. Number 3, balancing freedom and constraint. I once taught a kid who was a very, very skillful writer, but he hated it. And when I asked him why, he said, "Oh, I do like writing. I just don't like the way you make me do it," which was pretty harsh to hear, but was a fair reflection of how he felt. If we are too controlling, the children have a right to be frustrated. Perhaps sometimes we take the self-expression out of a medium which is designed for self-expression. However, on the other side, total freedom is not really helpful for them either. Actually, they find it even more scary than total control. So what we need to do is find the balance. We need to do that, and we'll explore how we do it. This might be especially helpful at re-engaging those students we know who do find poetry a bit boring and a little bit irrelevant. Making space for children to write about the things that they actually care about and are interested in, maybe we can fix that situation. Finally, be a writer with your kids. The research base is very, very strong on this one. Children benefit when their teachers engage with them authentically as real writers. This means we're sharing in the struggles and the pleasures of the written word. Being a writer alongside the children changes the classroom dynamic, and everybody benefits. So let's start with number 1, making it lively, making it playful. On the screen, I've got 4 words for you. Now, you might recognize where this comes from, some of you. If so, keep the origins of these words to yourselves. Instead, let's play along with this as if we're doing it in a lesson. These 4 words are from a poem that I love teaching with the 7- and 8-year-olds that I teach. These words can be considered nonsense words, living somewhere between sense and senselessness. All I would like you to do, everybody, perhaps in the chat, perhaps on your paper, is write down what they make you think of. Slithy is not a real word, but it probably paints a picture in your head. Maybe it makes you think of some other words. Write those down. What about if I described a creature as being mimsy? What do you imagine a mimsy creature is like? What does it make you think of? Keep on with your writing here, everyone. You're being very good students. Now, how do you think a creature is moving if it was whiffling through a forest? And for those of you who are doing this webinar in a communal area or a classroom or staff room, confuse your colleagues now by perhaps pulling a face that shows that you are experiencing an uffish thought. Take a moment to think of those words. I'm just going to see if there's anything in our chat. I believe there is not, and that is okay. All right. So hopefully you are recording your thoughts on your personal meaning of the word slithy and uffish, whiffling and mimsy. Thank you. I'm seeing things coming in now. Amalia and Sam, thank you so much. Makes me think of a fish thinking about nonsense. I like that. Dirty and silly. Very good indeed. So these words then, these are words where we are building the meaning. Now, we may recognize where this poem comes from. This is from The Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. Now, with my year 3 students, I like to teach nonsense poetry with them in the forest. They're learning to explore nature at the same time as learning to explore language. In this activity, a little like we did, I shared the poem with the children and we unpicked the language. We unpicked words like slithy. Now, most often when I talk to 7 and 8-year-olds about slithy, they say things like snake, slippery, snotty, slithering, and they come up with all of these different things. Now, when they put them all together, I say, so what do you think slithy looks like? If you were a slithy creature, what noise would you make? How would you move? So in this way, we start to playfully build the children's interpretation of these sounds, and we then use that in a kind of dramatic poetry session. We build the poem story using our own interpretations. Now, in this way, it's poetry, it's a reading lesson, it's a comprehension lesson, and it's experienced as play. Now, some representatives of this school are joining us in the meeting, so they'll be very familiar with this. We have a little clip here from the children's response to this activity. Let's see how the children interpreted those words. I think for the sake of time, we'll perhaps watch a minute-ish of this. Here we go, everybody. Movie time. Grab your popcorn.
He took his warple sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. Where could it be? Where could it be? Where could that Jabberwocky be? And as he of his sword he stood, the Jabberwocky! With eyes of flame, can ripple and thrill, the toady wood, and marble! with its head.
Sorry, everyone, I was on mute there. We'll pause it there. But hopefully, what comes through is not only the enjoyment that they have in retelling the poem, but also their depth of understanding of the structure of it, of the story, of the plot, and of the language. By becoming the action, by being the characters, the meaning of the poem comes through a lot more readily to them. So this isn't a performance lesson. It's a comprehension lesson. It's a reading lesson. The way that they say the words, the way they act it out is a demonstration of their personal interpretation of those nonsense words. Now, poetry doesn't always need to be like this. It doesn't always need to be so whimsical and fun, but it can be, and we all need a bit of that too. So explore ways to bring out the drama of the language through the dramatic ways in which you and your students choose to interpret it. Okay, next up, I would like to show you, yes, let's harness the power of chat in our poetry lessons. Now, I keep talking about poetry being a space for self-expression. This is how the children see it, and it's how poets see it too. But it's not always necessarily the way that it feels in school. In my experience, informal talk is a great vehicle to create poetry with children. In their chat, children are brimming with ideas and thoughts, and if we gently facilitate interesting conversations, there are often many seeds of poetry to be found in children's exchanges with us and with each other. So we can use chat in lots of different ways. We can plan chat into the writing and into the reading process, and this deepens children's comprehension. Let's start with this one up on the screen, okay? Let's just have a chat like we might do with the students. So I'm going to tell you an anecdote, everybody. I was walking home from school yesterday, and the sun made the sky go like a deep pink color, and it was so beautiful. Now, I don't know if you do this, but sometimes words like leak out of me. If I'm feeling a big thought, if I'm feeling a big feeling, sometimes the words just pop out too. And I just said, oh, it's perfect. And then it was so good in that moment, but I started thinking, perfect? Was it perfect? What would make a perfect afternoon? And that got me thinking, yeah, perfect afternoon. So for me, I think if I was having a perfect afternoon, maybe I'd have some time on my own and I'd have some time out in nature, but I'd also have some time with my friend chatting nonsense. Maybe we'd go to a cafe and have a carrot cake with thick buttercream. What would you be doing on your perfect afternoon? Let's chat about it, friends. Maybe this one is a great one to have in the chat. What sort of things might you be doing if you were having your perfect afternoon? Let me see some chat here. You can put it in your notepad if you like. The perfect afternoon. Sleeping. Very good point. We all need a nap. A book and coffee? Yes. Some reading? Good job. Crafting? Nice. Walking the dog in the park. Oh, look at that. What timing. Walking the dog in the park or walk in the woods with my dog. Jonathan and Sam, you guys should go and have a little adventure together and take those dogs. Maybe the dogs would become friends too. Nice. A chat with friends. Oh, these are great, everybody. These are great. So as we start chatting like this, imagine this, that we're not in virtual cyberspace here. We're in a classroom. We're hearing each other's responses. We're seeing these similarities we have with each other. And suddenly it becomes very easy for a child to share their opinion. A lot easier, perhaps, than if they were thinking of this solely as a poetry activity. The children might do the same sorts of things as us. Maybe they enjoy walking their dogs too. Maybe they enjoy playing football and scoring a hat trick, or chilling in the kitchen whilst their grandparents are cooking dinner. Maybe they talk about going to a roller coaster park, or they might talk about spending their afternoon as a famous gamer or a YouTuber. The room fills with chat, and it's all stuff that the children genuinely care about. And this is the nice, interesting teaching point. Then, once we've already got the conversation happening, that is when we steer it to poetry. That's when we could say, you know what, everyone? This conversation that we're having is making me think of this poem that I've just read. I've seen a poem where it takes all these ideas about a perfect afternoon, and it puts them into a really interesting shape. Can I show you? And then we can introduce a poem into the context of the chat. We're not deifying the poetry and saying, you must all fall silent before the poem, it is to be honored. No, I think we democratize what poetry is and we make it a tool for our relationships and interaction. This poem comes from one of those 12 books that you've got the teaching notes for, you lucky bears. My Favorite Day. So this is one of the newly published anthologies, and this poem is called A Recipe for a Fun Afternoon by Annalise Amoa. Now, I'm going to read it aloud for you. I know you'll be getting bored of my voice by now, but we'll do it anyway. Ingredients: a smile, comfortable clothes and shoes, a bicycle, a helmet, laughter, all of you. Recipe: 1. Take a smile and put it on your face. Keep it there. Prepare some comfy clothes and shoes, preferably colourful. 3. Grab a bicycle and a helmet. 4. Knock on the doors of all your friends. Tell them fun awaits. 5. Fill the air with a mix of laughter as you ride faster and faster, faster and faster, faster and faster through the park. 6. Make sure to look both ways. 7. Count how many trees you can see. 8. Lose count of how many times you've pedaled. 9. Glide across concrete, then grass. Do not be afraid to interrupt the mud. 10. Bring all that is inside you to the outside. Take up space, add a hint of happiness, and taste all that life has to offer. You know, guys, perhaps if we wanted to, we could try and borrow the shape of this poem, the ingredients and the recipe, to tell about our fun afternoon too. Can you see how this might work? So at this point then, the conversation has led to the poem, and then the poem leads back into the conversation, and we use that as the context for all of their ideas. We then get the children to create the poem about their perfect afternoon using this poem. So in this way, the chat becomes part of the planning process. It's a lovely structure, and the anthology texts in our collection, like this one, My Favorite Day, and where is it? There's so many. Here it is. My City and Me. These are anthologies with lots of different poets collaborating together. These different books introduce lots of poem styles by lots of new poets. Now, an extra aspect to mention here is that there's poetry hidden in our everyday speech. Sometimes the easiest and most enjoyable thing that we can do is notice the poetry potential of normal life. A phrase that I like to use a lot is, that should be in a poem, you should write it. On one of these poetry retreats that I run, I went to wake up the children. As you've probably discovered if you've ever done a residential trip, waking them is not usually necessary because they've usually been awake from about 5 a.m. And as always, that was the case. Now, when I knocked on the door, a very startled child was right in the middle of play fighting with his friend, and he thought he'd been caught out and he was in trouble. So when I knocked on the door to wake him up, he staggered backwards and was like, "But sir, it was only a light headbutt." Now, when it was clear that no one had actually been injured, I said to him, you know, that "but sir, it was only," that should be in a poem. You should write that. That was funny. And I told him to grab a pen and I told him to write. And you know what? He created a very interesting poem out of it. Let me show you. This is his excuse poem. It's a very quick little video, this one. I'm going to play it for you. So he just wrote this before he'd even got out of bed that day.
Poem, the excuse poem. But sir, it was only a light headbutt. But sir, it was only 3 punches. But sir, it was only a kick to the head. But sir, I just made a hole in the pod. But sir, I just dropped your phone down the hill. Okay then, no more excuses, sir.
So that was a poem that grew directly out of a child's everyday normal chatter. And it was something that he felt very attached to then because he knew it was born of his own experience. Now, I shared that poem with the children's poet Michael Rosen, and he had some interesting feedback on it. He said, this is very exciting, and I think what he's done is create his own form. We've got repetition with But sir, it was only... And he's found a way to mock himself with an inbuilt chorus. And we've got the but sir, which is him arguing with you. And it was only, when it clearly was not only. There's an irony and satire in it, which comes unstated, and that's what's clever about it. High praise from the Children's Laureate former there. So, great words from him. Now, I want to move on to 3 and 4, everybody. So, the third tip I want to share is about balance. It's about the balance between freedom and constraint. Now, we can think of this as being like the Goldilocks effect. We want to make sure the amount of freedom we give the children is not too little, not too much. We want it just right. Think about when you are teaching poetry writing lessons with your children. What is it that you're actually asking them to do? How much choice are they getting in what they're writing? Sometimes in our writing lessons, out of a desire to help them to improve, we take away almost all of the freedom. We tell them what to write about. We tell them how to write about it. We tell them which grammar features we want. In poetry, we might tell them we want particular poetic features as well. And we want it spelled correctly. And we want them to use proper English there. And we want the handwriting to be exquisite. We're wanting so much from them that whatever they create is really just our work mirrored back at us. Now, if we go too far the other way, we end up giving them a paralyzing amount of freedom. Children tend to like to know what the parameters are. They want to know our expectations, and if we leave them with the sense that anything goes, they tend to feel scared. So here's some advice, I suppose. When we're planning, think really carefully about what you're actually asking the children to do and which part of poetry you want them to focus on. Perhaps you could control and limit the content, but liberate the structure. For example, encouraging them to write a poem about their feelings in wintertime. Perhaps it could rhyme. Perhaps it could be a haiku. Perhaps it could be free verse. What you want to see and what you're focusing on there is whether they can use a poetic form, any poetic form, to communicate their feelings. And that's how to be successful in that task. Alternatively, you could go the other way. You could put some controls on the structure, but liberate the content. Encourage them to write a haiku, which has a 5-7-5 syllable pattern, and each line is a different idea. But what they write about is entirely up to them. What you want to see here, what you're focusing on, is whether they understand the syllable structure of a haiku. So we can think of this as a balancing act, but we can't expect them to sit at both sides of the seesaw at once. So be mindful of the equilibrium between freedom and constraint. And my final tip, before we open up a few questions, is this: write together. You are a writer. There are not many jobs out there which contain more professional writing than being a teacher. But so many of us struggle to perceive ourselves as writers, despite it being such an enormous part of what we do and what we teach. You need to embrace that role of being a writer-teacher. Now, there are 2 academics I want to flag up for you called Ross Young and Felicity Ferguson, and they run something called the Writing for Pleasure Centre. Cassie from Collins is going to post a little link for you to access here to see what they do. Now, their research, which I've linked to at the end as well, shows that it's very impactful when teachers write alongside the pupils. When the writing just appears as if by magic on a whiteboard as a pre-planned model, the children don't get to see the process. Writing can be a struggle. Writing can be a pleasure. And we can share the reality of that with them, writing alongside them, creating texts whilst they are creating texts. And I suppose an additional final suggestion would be this. Everything that we've looked at today, every benefit that I've said about for the children applies equally to us. Writing poetry can be a way for us to express ourselves as people and as teachers, if you're lucky enough to be able to separate those 2 things. It can be good for our mental health too. It can be a way for us to know about how we think, for us to know what we care about. It can be a way for us to connect with other people. So, Tying it all together then, when I titled this session, Preach It Before You Teach It, I suppose what I'm suggesting we should do is protect the time for our own creativity. Teaching is and will always be a very busy and stressful job. We all know this. And as challenging as it can be in many school systems, it falls to us as professionals sometimes to decide which aspects we want to prioritize in our practice. My recommendation is that by thinking about our own relationships with poetry, with story, with creative writing, we can achieve so much good stuff back in our classrooms. Empowering the children with a language to celebrate themselves, giving them the tools to advocate for themselves, lifting them up so that they can see the world beyond the one that they know, whilst reflecting everything that's happening in their reality too. So it's good for us, it's good for them, and dare I say it, it's good for society as well. So everybody, after this workshop, Collins will be sending out a set of teaching notes to you all to accompany those 12 Big Cat poetry books. I hope that some of you will will take the time to explore some new children's poetry, to continue doing some writing yourself. I know we've probably got some writers in the room here lurking around as well, and to inject some playful energy into the teaching of poetry in your classrooms. The books that you see on your screen are really interesting. If you want to go and explore those and see what they're all about, there is a QR code on your screen. If you just pull out your phone, you can take a picture of that and it will take you directly to the website to have a look at them. I know the links are being shared as we're doing the session, but here they all are as well. These are the links to the things that I've referenced in the webinar, including the research, the poetry resources, the Writing for Pleasure Centre, and Michael Rosen's Poetry Videos book as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. And my details are here. You're all very welcome to connect with me if you would like to. On Instagram and LinkedIn, I share the work that I'm doing as a poetry teacher, as a mythology educator, and as a children's writer. And I'm always working with schools and very happy to chat because I'm a massive geek, as you've probably ascertained by now. So thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to take any questions that you might have.